On a bleak June morning in 1692, a woman was shoved into a cart, leaving behind the foul-smelling darkness of a Salem jail. She was paraded through the town streets as a spectacle for the crowds on her way to a barren ridge. But she wasn't a murderer, at least not in any way we'd understand it today. She wasn't a thief or a traitor. Her crime, according to the court, was witchcraft. She was condemned for making a pact with the devil, tormenting the innocent, and turning her back on God. She would be the first of 19 people hanged in a wave of terror that would forever stain the conscience of a young America. Now, many people picture the victims of the Salem witch trials burning at the stake, but that's a myth born from European practices. In colonial Massachusetts, the end was the rope. This is the story of that first woman, the one who stood alone on the gallows, a woman whose flamboyant life and defiant spirit made her the perfect target for a town drowning in fear. This is the story of Bridget Bishop and her gruesome end. To understand how a woman could be hanged for little more than being herself, you have to understand the world she lived in. 17th century New England was a place of stark contrasts, breathtakingly beautiful but brutally hard. The Puritans who settled there wanted to build a city upon a hill, a perfect society dedicated to God. But their faith was an anxious one. They believed the devil wasn't some distant idea, but a real physical threat, constantly trying to tear down their holy experiment. The late 1600s were especially tense in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their royal charter, which gave them the freedom to govern themselves, had been yanked away in 1684. A new governor, appointed by the king, was a constant reminder of their lost power. On top of all this political mess, life was just plain hard. The colony was still shaken by the brutal King Philip's War, and the threat of attack was ever present. A recent smallpox epidemic had left a trail of terror, and the very wilderness surrounding their small towns was seen as the devil's backyard, a dark forest full of hidden dangers, both real and spiritual. Into this pressure cooker, you have to add the drama brewing inside Salem itself. Salem wasn't one big happy family, it was two separate and often feuding communities. Salem Town and Salem Village. Salem Town was a busy port with an economy driven by fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. It was more worldly and connected. But about 6 miles inland lay Salem Village, today the town of Danvers. This was the farming community where life was governed by the soil. For years, the villagers had resented the wealth and power of Salem Town. They'd fought to get their own church, but that only deepened the bitter rivalries over property lines, grazing rights, and the church's leadership under the controversial Reverend Samuel Parris. It was a society about to snap, a powder keg of religious zeal, political anxiety, and deep-seated paranoia. Every piece of bad luck, a failed crop, a sick child, a sudden death, could be seen as God's punishment or, even worse, an act of witchcraft. They were looking for someone to blame. And in the winter of 1692, when the daughter and niece of Reverend Parris began to have strange, violent fits, it seemed they had found their answer. A local doctor found no physical cause and made a diagnosis: bewitchment. The spark was lit. The witch hunt was on. Before she was labeled a witch, Bridget Bishop was a person, and to the grim, sober Puritans of Salem, she was a person who was impossible to ignore. Born in England around 1632, Bridget was a survivor. She was married 3 times, widowed twice, and by 1692 was living in Salem Town with her third husband, Edward Bishop. Unlike many of the other accused, Bridget wasn't from the gossipy, feuding Salem Village where the panic started. She was a townie, an outsider to their local drama, which might have made her an even easier target. During her examination, she said flatly, "I never saw these persons before, nor I never was in this place before." It's entirely possible she didn't even know her accusers. What really made Bridget stand out was her refusal to be invisible. In a world that demanded women be quiet and obedient, Bridget was fiercely independent and unapologetically vibrant. She owned property, inherited from her second husband, which was rare for a woman at the time. This gave her a level of economic freedom that many found unsettling. You could see her independence in how she dressed and how she lived. While Puritan women were expected to wear dark, simple clothes, Bridget wore a striking red paragon bodice decorated with colorful embroidery. In a sea of black and gray, that red bodice was a splash of defiance. It was a clear signal that she would not be muted. Adding to her reputation was her social life. Bridget was known for entertaining guests in her Salem town home, keeping late hours and allowing the game of shovelboard, an activity frowned upon by the more pious folks. Her house was a place of lively conversation and entertainment, breaking all the strict Puritan rules. She was a public figure, a woman who served men drinks and engaged them in worldly chat. Her personal life was just as public and stormy. Her second marriage to Thomas Oliver was famously rocky. They were known to have vicious public arguments, even on the Sabbath. They were once even punished for it by being forced to stand gagged back to back in the public marketplace. Years before the trials, her husband Thomas had once declared that she was a bad wife. The devil had come bodily to her, and she sat up all night with the devil. That accusation stuck, lingering in the public memory. She was already marked by gossip. So Bridget Bishop was the living embodiment of what the Puritan establishment feared. A woman who didn't know her place. She owned property, ran a social house, dressed boldly, and refused to be a quiet, subjugated wife. This made people talk. It made her a subject of gossip. And in the fevered atmosphere of 1692, it made her the perfect scapegoat. The madness began in the dead of winter, inside the home of Salem Village's own minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started having terrifying fits. They screamed, threw things, twisted their bodies into bizarre shapes, and cried out that they were being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. Soon, other young women in the village were showing the same signs of torment. The accusations started by targeting easy scapegoats. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an ill woman caught up in property disputes. But as the afflicted girls' performances grew more dramatic, the net widened. On April 18, 1692, a warrant was issued for Bridget Bishop. The next day, she was arrested and taken to a local tavern for a pre-trial examination before the magistrates. The scene that greeted her was one of calculated chaos. The moment Bridget walked into the room, the afflicted girls collapsed in agony. This was the main evidence against her, their performance of suffering. Magistrate John Hathorne, an ancestor of the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, got straight to the point. "Bishop, what do you say?" "You here stand charged with sundry acts of witchcraft." Bridget, who had actually been cleared of a similar charge years earlier, denied it all. "I am innocent, I know nothing of it," she insisted, claiming she was as innocent as the child unborn. But her denials were useless. Every time she moved her head, the girls would writhe and scream. When she simply looked at them, they'd fall down as if struck. The magistrates and the crowd didn't see a cruel act. They saw undeniable proof of her dark power. Hathorne pressed her. "How is it, then, that your appearance doth hurt these?" All Bridget could say was, "I am innocent. I know not what a witch is." The accusations piled on, a bizarre mix of spectral visions and old neighborhood grudges. Men who had worked on her house years earlier now came forward claiming they'd found poppets, small dolls made of rags with pins stuck in them, hidden in her cellar walls, a sure sign of dark magic. A dyer testified that she'd brought him small pieces of lace he now believed were for dressing these dolls. Another man claimed her specter flew into his room at night and tried to choke him. The gossip was a whirlwind, and it became hard to separate rumor from official testimony. She was forced to undergo a humiliating physical exam as a group of women searched her body for a witch's teat, a supposed mark where she suckled demonic spirits. A preternatural mark was allegedly found, but when they checked again hours later, it was gone. This wasn't seen as a mistake, but as further proof of her mysterious, devilish power. Every aspect of her life that defied the Puritan norm, her public disputes, her colorful clothes, her independent nature, was now twisted into proof of guilt. On June 2, 1692, Bridget Bishop was the first person brought before the new court of Oyer and Terminer, a special court set up just to handle the witchcraft cases. The name literally means to hear and to determine, but for Bridget, the determination had already been made. The judges, especially the fanatical Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, truly believed they were fighting a holy war. The trial was a legal sham. Bridget, like all the accused, had no lawyer. The idea of innocent until proven guilty was flipped on its head. The burden was on her to prove she wasn't a witch, an impossible task when the main evidence was spectral. This spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls that Bridget's spirit attacked them while her body was somewhere else, was fully allowed. How do you defend yourself against a crime your ghost supposedly committed miles away? The courtroom was pure theater. Whenever Bridget looked at the afflicted girls, they shrieked and convulsed, only to be cured by her touch, a twisted proof used again and again in the trials. In one dramatic moment, a witness claimed he had torn Bridget's coat while fighting off her specter. When they looked at her actual coat, they found a tear in the exact same place. To the terrified people in that courtroom, this was an undeniable link between the woman and her evil deeds. Testimonies were repeated and embellished. Her public fights, her late-night entertaining, it was all paraded as evidence of a diabolical nature. The powerful minister Cotton Mather later wrote that there was little occasion to prove the witchcraft, it being evident and notorious to all beholders. In other words, you just had to look at the screaming girls and the defendant's scandalous life to know she was guilty. Through it all, Bridget Bishop stood her ground. She proclaimed her innocence over and over. "I have made no contract with the devil," she stated. "I have never seen him before in my life." When Magistrate Hathorne accused her of acting like a witch right there in the courtroom, she shot back, "I am innocent to a witch. I know not what a witch is." Hathorne's chilling, circular reply was, "How can you know you're no witch, and yet not know what a witch is?" There was no escaping that kind of logic. Her denials were seen as lies. Her anger was seen as demonic fury. The trial lasted just one day. The jury, faced with a mountain of spectral testimony and neighborhood gossip, found Bridget Bishop guilty of witchcraft and sentenced her to death by hanging. She was the first. The legal machinery of death was now officially in motion. For 8 days, Bridget Bishop sat in jail, a condemned woman. The time between her conviction on June 2nd and her execution on June 10th must have been an eternity. She had maintained her innocence, but the highest court in the colony had declared her a friend of the devil. There would be no mercy. On the morning of June 10th, Sheriff George Corwin arrived to carry out the sentence. Bridget was loaded into a cart for a final public parade meant to warn everyone of the price of witchcraft. The cart rumbled through the streets, likely passing the homes of the very men who had condemned her. Crowds would have gathered to watch, their faces a mix of fear, morbid curiosity, and righteous satisfaction. The destination was a low, rocky ridge at the edge of town. For centuries, people assumed the hangings took place on the higher summit of Gallows Hill, but modern research has confirmed the true spot was this more public ledge, known today as Proctor's Ledge. There, a large tree likely served as the gallows. The end was brutal. Hanging in the 17th century wasn't the quick drop we see in movies. It was slow, agonizing strangulation. Bridget would have stood on the cart or a ladder as the rope was placed around her neck. After a final statement in which she reportedly professed her innocence to the last, the cart would have been pulled away, leaving her to struggle for air. The execution was meant to be a cleansing ritual. As another group was hanged later, the Reverend Nicholas Noyes would declare, What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there. That was how they saw it. They weren't killing people, they were purging evil from their community. The indignity didn't end with death. As was the custom for convicted witches, Bridget was denied a Christian burial. It's widely believed her body was cut down and unceremoniously dumped in a shallow crevice nearby, an unmarked grave for a woman whose only real crime was being herself in a world that demanded conformity. She died alone on that ridge, the first official victim of a shameful chapter in American history. Bridget Bishop's execution wasn't the end of the Salem witch hunt. It was the start of its deadliest phase. Her death didn't calm the hysteria. It validated it. It sent a clear message. The threat is real, the court is serious, and we are winning the war against the devil. In the months that followed, 18 more people would be hanged. But even then, some people had doubts. One of the judges, Nathaniel Saltonstall, was so disturbed by Bridget's trial that he resigned from the court in protest. He saw that she was condemned more for her reputation than for any real crime. He smartly remarked she was targeted for little more than wearing scarlet countenancing shovelboard and getting herself talked about. He saw her not as a witch, but as a scapegoat. As the year went on and the accusations spiraled out of control, targeting even respected citizens, public opinion finally began to turn. Governor William Phipps, maybe spurred to action after his own wife was accused, finally halted the trials in October 1692. In the years that followed, there were public apologies and days of remorse. In 1711, the government restored the rights and good names of many victims and paid compensation to their families. But Bridget Bishop was not on that list. For centuries, her conviction stood. It wasn't until Halloween of 2001, more than 300 years after her death, that Bridget Bishop and 4 other women were finally formally exonerated. Bridget Bishop's story is more than just a historical tragedy. She was the test case. Her trial set the deadly precedent that allowed spectral evidence and public panic to pass for justice. She was targeted because she was different, because her independent life challenged the rigid order of Puritan New England. The very qualities we might admire today, her independence, her business sense, her refusal to be silenced, made her a threat in 1692. She became a convenient vessel for an entire community's fears. Her story is a chilling cautionary tale about how quickly fear can crush reason, and how a society under pressure can turn on its most vulnerable, or simply its most different members. What do you think was the real reason she was targeted? Was it her flamboyant lifestyle, her property, or was she just in the wrong place at the wrong time?